The restraints snapped like twigs. Bobby Vance lunged, his fist slamming into my ribs, a crack of bone, a burst of white-hot pain. I had seconds to react, a syringe of sedative in my shaking hand. If I failed, he'd expose everything. The autopsy report. The woman I killed. His whisper burned in my ear. I saw what you did. The truth wasn't just coming for me. It was already here. The fluorescent light hummed, a low-frequency vibration that rattled against David Miller's molars. He smoothed the autopsy report across his mahogany desk, the paper crisp and unforgiving under his trembling fingertips. Page 4 contained the sentence, a single clinical observation regarding the nick in the mesenteric artery. It transformed his brilliant surgical save into a homicide. Rain lashed against the window pane of his office at St. Jude's Memorial, blurring the Chicago skyline into smears of amber and gray. David reached for his coffee mug, but the ceramic chattered against his teeth. He set it down, the dark liquid sloshing over the rim to bloom like a bruise on the blotter. His chest tightened, a phantom hand squeezing his ribs until his breath hitched in shallow, jagged gasps. He looked at his hands. They were scrubbed raw, the skin a weeping pink from the 3-stage ritual he had performed 6 times since morning. He had killed that woman. He had slipped a fraction of a millimeter, and then he had buried the truth in a mountain of insurance claims and professional prestige. The perfection he had cultivated like a garden was rotting from the roots up. If this paper left the room, his life didn't just change, it ended. The medical license, the house in Oak Park, the respect of his peers. All of it would vanish into the sterile wind of a courtroom. A sharp rap on the door fractured the silence, sounding like a gunshot in the cramped office. David's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. "David, you still in there?" Sarah pushed the door open before he could respond. She smelled of rain and peppermint tea, a scent that usually grounded him but now felt like an intrusion. She leaned against the frame, her damp coat dripping onto the linoleum with a rhythmic tap, tap, tap. "The board meeting starts in 10 minutes, she said, tilting her head, her brow furrowing in that way that meant she was dissecting his expression. "You look like you've swallowed a bone." David slid the report under a stack of billing statements. The friction of the paper sounded like a scream. "Stomach bug," he muttered, wiping his palms on his trousers. The fabric felt rough, sandpaper against his sensitized skin. "You're gray, David." Sarah stepped closer, the gold locket at her throat clicking as she toyed with it. Click, snap, click, snap. "Go home. I'll tell them the salmon at the gala finally caught up with you." "I am fine." He stood, his knees popping. He needed to shred the document, to watch the ink dissolve into gray confetti. But his hands refused to move toward the drawer. Instead, he gripped the edge of the desk, waiting for his heart to find its rhythm. He couldn't let her see. He couldn't let anyone see the crack in the porcelain. The door flew open again, but it wasn't a gentle intrusion this time. Emily Carter, a junior nurse whose scrubs were always a size too large and perpetually wrinkled, stumbled into the room. Her ponytail was lopsided, and her face was flushed a frantic shade of red. "Dr. Miller, you have to come, you know?" she stammered, her voice rising at the end in a desperate plea for acknowledgement. "It's the pre-op bay. Patient in bed 4, Bobby Vance. He's gone completely off, you know. He's screaming, tearing at the restraints. Security is 5 minutes out, but he's going to hurt himself, you know." David felt a surge of adrenaline that tasted like copper. It was a reprieve, a reason to leave the office, to hide the report, to be the great Dr. Miller again. He shoved the drawer shut, the lock clicking with finality. "I am coming, Emily. Sarah, please find Stephen. Tell him I will be at the meeting as soon as the patient is stabilized." He brushed past Emily, the scent of her nervous sweat mixing with the omnipresent hospital bleach. As they hurried down the hallway, the floor tiles acted as mirrors, reflecting David's own panicked face back at him from beneath his feet. He felt like he was walking on thin ice, waiting for the first crack to swallow him whole. The pre-op bay was a chaos of sound. The rhythmic whoosh-click of ventilators was drowned out by a man's guttural roars. David pushed through the plastic curtains, the static electricity from the sheets stinging his skin. Bobby Vance was a mountain of a man, his muscles corded and straining against the nylon straps of the gurney. His face was a mask of primal fury, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for a ghost. "Vials! I saw the vials!" Bobby shrieked, his voice cracking. "You think you can hide the bodies? You think the ink stays dry? Murders! All of you murderers!" Emily shrank back, her shoulders hunching. "He just started, you know. One minute he was quiet, the next he was like this, you know." David stepped into the splash zone. "Mr. Vance, I am Dr. Miller. I need you to breathe. We are here to help you." Bobby's head snapped toward David. For a second, the rage vanished, replaced by a terrifying, lucid focus. He lunged upward, the force of his movement snapping one of the plastic buckles. A heavy, calloused fist caught David square in the ribs. The air left David's lungs in a sickening wheeze. He stumbled back, his side erupting in a white-hot flare of agony. He hit the metal supply cart, and the crash of falling kidney basins echoed like thunder in the sterile room. "David!" Emily cried out. "Stay back!" David gasped, clutching his side. He could feel the bruise forming, a physical mark of his failure to maintain control. He reached into the cart, his fingers finding a preloaded syringe of lorazepam. "Hold his legs, Emily. Now!" David threw his weight onto Bobby's chest, ignoring the stabbing pain in his own ribs. The man felt like hot iron under his hands. David jammed the needle into the port of the IV line. He watched the clear liquid enter the vein, a chemical peace offering. Slowly, the tension ebbed out of Bobby's limbs. His head fell back against the thin pillow. The roars subsided into ragged, wet gasps. "Good work, David." A booming voice echoed from the doorway. Stephen Harris stood there, his barrel chest puffed out, his hand already rising to tugs at his silk tie. 1, 2, 3. The signature tie tug of a man who owned the room. "Handled it like a pro. That's why you're the best we've got. This riffraff doesn't know how lucky they are to have a Miller on the case." David straightened his glasses, his breath still shaky. "The patient required immediate intervention, Stephen. It was a standard procedure." "Standard? You saved the ward a lawsuit and a lot of broken equipment." Stephen clapped him on the shoulder, the impact vibrating through David's bruised ribs. "Clean yourself up. We've got a board to impress." Stephen marched out, his military posture radiating a confidence David envied. Emily began picking up the scattered basins, her hands trembling. "You're a hero, Dr. Miller, you know. He would have killed someone, you know." David didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a fraud. He stepped closer to the bed to check Bobby's vitals, his hand reaching for the man's wrist. Suddenly, Bobby's hand shot out, gripping David's collar with a strength that shouldn't have been possible for a sedated man. He pulled David down until their noses were inches apart. Bobby smelled of stale cigarettes and a deep, underlying rot. "I saw it," Bobby whispered, the words barely a breath. "The bay next to me last month. Room 302. I saw you drop the vial. I saw the blood on your shoes when you walked out. I know what you did to that girl, Miller." The world tilted. The hum of the lights became a deafening roar. Bobby wasn't a random patient. He wasn't a psychiatric break. He was a witness. "I'm here for you, Doc," Bobby hissed, his eyes fluttering as the sedative finally took hold. "I'm the one who doesn't burn." His grip slackened. His hand fell to the bed with a dull thud. David stood frozen, the ghost of the man's words clawing at his throat. The psychiatric break had been a lure. Bobby Vance had tracked him down. He had walked into the lion's den just to tell the lion he knew where the bones were buried. David backed away, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm. He needed to think. He needed to scrub. He turned and bolted for the locker room, the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the soap dispenser already echoing in his mind. The locker room smelled of cedar and old sweat. David stood at the sink, the water scalding his hands. 1, 2, 3. He lathered the soap until it was a thick, white foam. He scrubbed the backs of his hands, the spaces between his fingers, the undersides of his nails. 1, 2, 3. He looked at his reflection in the spotted mirror. His glasses were fogged, and his eyes looked like hollowed-out craters. Bobby Vance was a contractor. That's what the chart said. But contractors didn't talk like that. They didn't hunt surgeons. The door swung open, and Stephen Harris walked in, already shedding his lab coat. "Change of plans, David. The ER just got slammed with a multi-car pileup on I-90. We're losing OR space fast. I've bumped Vance's gallbladder surgery up. We go in 2 hours." David froze, his hands still covered in suds. 2 hours. "Stephen, the patient just had a violent episode. We should observe him for at least 24... "We don't have 24 hours, Stephen snapped, his hand flying to his tie. "Tug, tug, tug. The board is looking at our efficiency metrics. We turn the beds or we lose funding. Besides, you already sedated him. He's stable. Get it done, David. It's a routine cholecystectomy. A monkey could do it. But my ribs." "Take an aspirin and be a man," Stephen said, his tone sharpening. "I'm counting on you. Don't let a little bruise ruin your streak." Stephen disappeared into the showers, leaving David alone with the sound of running water. 2 hours. He had 2 hours to figure out how to silence a man who was about to go under his knife. David dried his hands until the paper towel came away red. He needed to know who Bobby Vance was. He needed to know if he had told anyone else. He walked to the nursing station, his gait stiff to protect his ribs. The hallway felt longer than usual, the flickering fluorescent light above the desk casting jerky, unnatural shadows. He sat at the terminal, his fingers hovering over the keys. He entered his credentials. "Access denied." He tried again, slower this time. "Access denied. Credentials revoked." A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. This wasn't a glitch. He tried to bypass the security screen, using a backdoor code he'd seen the IT guys use once. The screen turned a jarring, deep red. A message appeared in white block letters. "System monitored. Unauthorized access attempt recorded. Reporting to administration." David pushed back from the desk, his chair screeching against the tile. Someone was watching him. Was it Bobby? Or was it the hospital? Was the system finally closing its jaws? Dr. Miller? He jumped, his heart nearly leaping out of his chest. It was Mike Higgins, the night shift security guard. Mike was a thick-necked man who always looked like he was nursing a grudge. He was leaning against the wall, shuffling a stack of sugar packets in his pocket. Crinkle, crinkle, crinkle. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Doc." Mike said, his voice a low gravel. Or maybe just something you weren't supposed to see on that screen. The system is experiencing some latency, David said, his voice tight. I require the pharmacy logs for my next patient. Pharmacy's in the basement, Doc. Vault's locked tight this time of night. Only people with special permission get in there. Mike stepped closer, the smell of cheap coffee and tobacco rolling off him. Funny thing, I was doing my rounds by the morgue earlier. Found a shredder jammed with some interesting paperwork, autopsy stuff, about a woman who died last month. David felt the floor drop away. He gripped the edge of the desk so hard his knuckles turned white. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do. Mike pulled a sugar packet from his pocket, squinting at the date he'd scrawled on it in permanent marker. I think you'd pay a lot to make sure that Shredder gets fixed and the paper stays gone. A silence tax, let's call it. Say, $50,000? A small price for a career like yours? This is extortion, David whispered. This is business, Doc. You've got 2 hours until your surgery. I'll meet you in the pharmacy vault. It's quiet there. We can discuss the payment plan. Mike turned and walked away, his keys jingling on his belt like a death knell. David was trapped. The investigator was on the table, and the guard was at his throat. He needed to get to the vault, not to pay Mike, but to get the anesthetic he needed to make sure Bobby Vance didn't wake up until David was ready. Or perhaps to make sure he didn't wake up at all. The pharmacy vault was a tomb. The air was thin and smelled of recycled oxygen and cold metal. A high-security cooling unit thrummed in the corner, a vibration that made David's teeth ache. He stood among the rows of narcotics, his eyes scanning the labels. Morphine, fentanyl, propofol. He reached for a vial of the heavy stuff, his hand shaking. Looking for a way out, David? Mike Higgins stepped from behind a row of shelves. He wasn't smiling anymore. He looked hungry. I told you I would meet you here, David said, his voice regaining some of its clinical coldness. I do not have $50,000 in my pocket. Then we've got a problem. Mike stepped into David's personal space, his heavy brow furrowed. Because if I don't get my taste, that report goes to the DA tonight. I'm tired of being the guy who opens the doors for people like you. I want what's mine. I cannot give you what I do not have. Then I'll take it out of your hide. Mike lunged. He was faster than he looked. He grabbed David by the throat, slamming him back against the reinforced steel wall. The impact sent a jolt of pain through David's bruised ribs that made his vision swim. You think you're better than me? Mike hissed, his fingers digging into David's windpipe. You're just a killer in a cleaner suit. David fumbled behind him, his hand closing around the cold, heavy cylinder of a portable oxygen tank. He didn't think. He didn't calculate. He swung. The metal tank connected with Mike's temple with a sickening thud. The guard's eyes rolled back, and his grip slackened. He slid down the wall, a heap of blue polyester and jingling keys. David stood over him, gasping for air. The silence in the vault was absolute, save for the hum of the cooler. He had just assaulted a security guard. He had crossed a line he could never uncross. He grabbed the vials he needed and bolted for the door. He didn't use the elevator. He took the stairs. 12. 13. 14. A voice echoed from the landing above, rhythmic, cold. 15. 16. 17. David froze. It was Richard Taylor, the chief of medicine. The man was a ghost in the hospital, a shadow that moved through the halls counting the steps. David ducked into the shadows of the landing, his heart hammering. He watched through the crack in the door as Taylor descended, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his eyes fixed on some invisible point in the air. 21. 22. Taylor passed by without looking, the scent of sandalwood lingering in the cold air. David waited until the sound of the footsteps faded before pushing through the fire door onto the 3rd floor. He was almost to the OR when a hand grabbed his arm. David. Thank God. It was Sarah. She looked frantic, her locket clicking at a blurring speed. Click, snap, click, snap. Sarah. What are you doing here? I told you to go home. A man called the house, David. She was trembling, her eyes wide with a fear he'd never seen before. He said he was a friend of Bobby Vance. He asked if the girls were home. He said he wanted to make sure you were taking good care of Bobby. The threat had left the hospital. It was at his front door. Go to your sister's, David said, his voice a low, urgent growl. Take the girls. Do not go home. Do not answer the phone. Do you understand? David, what is happening? Who is this man? Just go, Sarah. I will explain everything after the surgery. Just go. He watched her run toward the exit, her heels clicking on the tile. He felt a hole opening in his chest. He was losing them. He was losing everything. He ducked into a nearby break room and found an unattended terminal. He didn't use his own login. He used a generic guest account and accessed the public records database. He typed in the name, Bobby Vance. The results flooded the screen. Bobby Vance wasn't a contractor. He was a former investigator for the State Medical Board. He had been dismissed 5 years ago after a scandal involving illegal wiretapping and entrapment. He was a Dr. Hunter, a man who broke the law to catch people who broke their oaths. The psychiatric break hadn't been a mental collapse. It had been a performance. Bobby had gotten himself onto David's table to force a confession, to catch David in a moment of weakness. The intercom crackled. Dr. Miller to OR4. Dr. Miller to OR4 immediately. The stage was set. The hunter was on the table, and the prey was holding the knife. The operating room was a cathedral of cold light. The massive surgical lamps hung like predatory eyes, casting a sterile glare over the draped figure of Bobby Vance. The only sound was the rhythmic whoosh click of the ventilator, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to mock the fragile life it sustained. David stood at the head of the table, his hands encased in latex, his face masked. He felt the weight of the room, the gravity of the gaze of the surgical team. Patient is prepped, Emily said, her voice muffled by her mask. Vitals are steady, you know. We're ready to begin, you know. Stephen Harris stood across from David, his eyes sharp above his mask. Let's keep it moving, David. I want this gallbladder out in 20 minutes. I've got a dinner reservation at 8 o'clock. David picked up the scalpel. The cold metal felt like an extension of his own numbed nerves. He looked at Bobby's face. Peaceful now, the rage hidden behind a veil of anesthesia. Making the initial incision, David said. As the blade touched the skin, the heart rate monitor began to chirp. A rapid, frantic staccato. Heart rate is climbing, Emily warned. 110, 120. He's reacting to the stimulus, you know? Increase the anesthetic, David, Stephen commanded. He's fighting it. Give him another 5 of the propofol. His blood pressure is already borderline, David countered, his eyes fixed on the monitor. If I increase the dosage now, we risk a respiratory collapse. I didn't ask for a consultation. I gave an order. Stephen's voice boomed, echoing off the tiled walls. I've done 1,000 of these. The man is a tank. He can handle it. Bump the dose or get off the table. David hesitated. A higher dose would keep Bobby under, perhaps permanently. It would be a surgical complication. An accident. Exactly what Mike Higgins had wanted. He looked at the monitor. Something was wrong. The rhythm was irregular, a subtle skip that he hadn't noticed in the pre-op notes. "Wait," David said, leaning closer. "Look at the QT interval. It's prolonged. So he has a slight arrhythmia," Stephen dismissed. "Half the population does. Increase the dose." "No," David said, his voice gaining a sudden, unexpected strength. "This isn't just an arrhythmia. This is a chronic condition. Look at the way the wave recedes. This man has been on heavy medication for years, probably beta blockers. His psychiatric break wasn't just theater. It was a physiological reaction to the stress on a compromised heart." This was the key. If Bobby had a pre-existing condition he hadn't disclosed, his testimony would be shredded in court. A disgraced investigator with a history of heart-induced delusions. David could win. He could save himself without killing anyone. The door to the OR hissed open. Mike Higgins walked in, wearing a set of oversized scrubs that didn't hide the dark bruise on his temple. He carried a clipboard, acting like he was checking the equipment. He moved behind David, the smell of sugar and sweat cutting through the scent of ozone. David felt a hard, cold shape press against the small of his back. "Do it now, Doc," Mike whispered, his voice a low vibration against David's ear. "1 extra cc, that's all it takes. Make it look like a heart attack. If he wakes up, we both go to jail. If he stays down, we both go home." David froze, the scalpel trembling in his hand. He was trapped between a corrupt guard's gun and a mentor's arrogance. The perfect life he had built was a cage, and the bars were closing in. "David, what are you waiting for?" Stephen barked. "The clock is ticking." David looked at Bobby Vance. The man was his enemy. He was a hunter who wanted to destroy him. But he was also a patient. "I am a healer," David thought, the words sounding hollow even to himself. "Or am I just a man who is afraid to lose his house?" Suddenly, the monitors emitted a long, continuous flatline tone. "He's coding," Emily screamed. "Vitals are gone, you know? We lost the pulse, you know?" "What did you do?" Stephen lunged toward the anesthetic controls. "You overdosed him." "I didn't touch the dial," David shouted, his eyes darting to the oxygen flow meter. The glass tube was empty. The little red ball had dropped to the bottom. "The oxygen line," David gasped. "It's been cut." He looked at Mike Higgins, but the guard looked just as terrified as he was. Mike backed away, his hands raised. "I didn't do that. I just wanted the money." David turned to the wall where the main lines entered the room. He saw a small mechanical bypass valve, a piece of equipment that shouldn't have been there. It was a signature, a clean way to end a problem. He looked at Stephen Harris. The head surgeon wasn't panicking. He was standing perfectly still, his hand reaching for his tie. Tug, tug, tug. "It's for the best, David," Stephen said, his voice cold and flat. The man was a nuisance, a variable we couldn't control. This way, the hospital is protected. You are protected. We'll call it a mechanical failure. The board will understand. Stephen had done it. The mentor was protecting the protege by murdering the witness. "No," David said. "David, don't be a fool. Step away from the table." David didn't step away. He grabbed the manual ventilation bag, the ambu bag, and jammed the mask over Bobby's face. "Emily, get me the emergency cart, now!" "David, that is an order," Stephen roared. David ignored him. He began to pump the bag, forcing air into Bobby's lungs. Squeeze, release, squeeze, release. I am not a murderer, David whispered. And I am not you. He worked like a man possessed. He performed a risky, blind bypass of the oxygen line using a length of suction tubing, his fingers moving with a precision he hadn't felt in years. He ignored the gun at his back, the shouting of his mentor, the screaming of the alarms. He was a doctor. For the first time in a month, he was actually a doctor. The monitor chirped. A single, weak blip. Then another. "We have a rhythm," Emily whispered, tears streaming down her face. "He's back, you know. He's back." David slumped against the table, his breath coming in jagged gasps. He looked at Stephen Harris. The titan of surgery looked small. He looked old. "Security is on the way," David said, his voice steady. For all of us, the intensive care unit was quiet, the only sound the rhythmic hiss-thump of the machines. David sat by Bobby Vance's bed, his lab coat gone, his hands resting in his lap. They weren't shaking anymore. Bobby opened his eyes. They were clear, the rage replaced by a weary curiosity. "You saved me," Bobby whispered. "It is my job," David said. "I didn't have the vial, Miller." Bobby managed a weak, jagged smile. "I didn't have the blood on the shoes. I was bluffing. I just wanted to see what you'd do when the lights went out. I wanted to see if there was anything left inside that suit." David felt a strange, light sensation in his chest. The secret didn't have power anymore. The perfect Dr. Miller was dead, and he didn't miss him. "There is," David said. He stood up and walked out of the room. He didn't go to his office. He didn't go to the locker room to scrub his hands. He walked out of the hospital, the cool night air hitting his face like a blessing. He saw the city lights, no longer smears of amber, but sharp and clear. He drove to the district attorney's office in the heart of the city. The building was dark, but a single window was lit on the 4th floor. David Miller, the man who never made mistakes, walked through the front doors. Subverted. David sat across from Assistant District Attorney Marcus Thorne. The room smelled of old paper and stale coffee. David didn't hesitate. He laid it all out, the nicked artery, the falsified report, the cover-up, the bypass valve in the OR. He felt a profound sense of peace with every word. He was finally telling the truth. He was reclaiming his soul. "I am prepared to accept the consequences," David said, his voice firm. "I want to make it right." Thorne looked at him for a long time, then sighed and leaned back in his leather chair. "You think this makes it right, David? You think a confession is a get-out-of-jail card for your conscience?" "I am being honest," David said, a frown creasing his brow. "I am taking responsibility." "No," Thorne said, his voice turning cold. "You're being selfish. By coming here, you've just handed me a political nightmare. You've destroyed the credibility of the city's largest hospital. You've ensured that every surgery Stephen Harris ever performed will be litigated. And your family? Do you think Sarah wants to be the wife of a disgraced felon? Do you think your daughters want to visit you through a glass partition?" David felt a cold prickle of unease. I had to tell the truth. The truth is a luxury you can't afford, David. Thorne pulled a file from his drawer. It was the original autopsy report, the one David thought he had hidden. Stephen Harris sent this over an hour ago, along with a statement saying you've been suffering from a psychotic break due to overwork. He's already filed for your involuntary commitment. What? No, I am sane. I am telling you I did it. It doesn't matter what you say, Thorne said, standing up. The system doesn't want your honesty. It wants its stability. By confessing, you didn't save yourself, David. You just made yourself a liability that needs to be removed. 2 uniformed officers entered the room. They weren't there to take a statement. They were carrying restraints. "He's delusional," Thorne said to the officers, not looking at David. "Take him to the psychiatric wing at St. Jude's, under Dr. Harris's personal care." David lunged for the door, but the officers were faster. As the cold metal of the handcuffs bit into his raw, scrubbed wrists, David realized the final, terrible truth. He had sought redemption, but he had only found a smaller, more permanent cage. He had traded his career for the truth, and the truth had cost him his freedom. As they dragged him down the hall, the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of his own heart sounded exactly like the soap dispenser in the locker room. 1, 2, 3. The end.